Um, at the risk of sounding almost optimistic, a word I am usually very careful of, there are at least signs that those who have their hands on some levers of power are getting very concerned. For example, planners, councillors, Debbie for instance, mayors, municipalities, chambers of commerce, investors, business owners, farmers, the list gets longer every day. And I think at least that's a very good start. And I will openly declare that I am encouraged, that I am seeing and sensing a real effort on the part of many different and sometimes opposing groups and interests, at least to talk and hear each other's ideas. And I think this conference is an excellent example of that. We don't all agree about all of the things. There are some commonalities, but we need to discuss and talk to each other, and I think that's really starting to happen. As we start to get our hands dirty again with soil and with making things, we will need to start learning again from many different people, maybe people we have got used to not talking to. And I think this is really exciting. Now, some of what I'm going to talk about is in the last chapter of my gas book, one of the few critical books on natural gas, called High Noon for Natural Gas. And I'm instructed to say that the book and also the oil age poster is available at the back, directly down there at the back of the hall, from some wonderful volunteers, post-carbon volunteers. I gather much of the selling of items has to cease almost immediately after this panel, so that's your chance to get it immediately after this panel. And also, I should also mention, since once I get going, I have a tendency to forget these things, they're important, that there's various literature like the brochure and oil depletion postcard and the relocalization information at the same table at the back. So lest I forget, I've done my duty. Some of what I'm going to say is in the last chapter of my gas book. Last chapter barely mentions gas. It's all about what to do about these kinds of energy problems. And also a great deal more is in our new book, Relocalize Now, Getting Ready for Climate Change and the End of Cheap Oil, which is due out in the spring of 2007 with New Society Publishers, who are, of course, a sponsor of this event. And a lot of information is also available for free on our various websites, and if you go to postcarbon.org, that's the place to start. Now, at many a talk I give, especially when I'm in front of people who are relatively unfamiliar with these subjects, I often mention that, in case you don't like what I'm going to say, I'm from the land of Monty Python, and therefore it may all be nonsense. But in front of this audience, I hope I don't need to make that preface in such earnest. I wanted to pick up some of the intriguing statements and phrases that I'd heard in the last couple of days, and they'll sort of form a preface to what I'm going to say. We're climbing up the heat ladder, and we've become a roaring flame. We're living like gods. I used to be a poet. I love these kinds of things. They ring and resonate. There is an inexorable tendency of our society to grow. Any size of resource can be overwhelmed by exponential growth, and indeed I would say any growth, actually. We can't say the word smaller. How about less big? Technology alone will not solve this. It will take behavioral changes. We need an energy policy, I think that means the US, and we need a world energy policy. There's a supply side and a demand side division. We need to talk on a systems basis. The US is plumbed the wrong way. A lot more interesting things are happening at local and state level than at federal level. Reduce the number of vehicles by some miracle. Those two were separated statements, but I thought they went together quite interestingly. Limits to growth. Demand destruction means recession, depression, unemployment. Demand reduction, not destruction. Another phrase. No option gives you any kick in less than a decade. Use less energy so that we can make the transition. We have to reorganize. Coming down is dangerous. This time, it really matters. And finally, I'll add one of my own. We can't win the war against nature. So I think we should stop fighting nature. Now, growth, especially exponential growth, will overwhelm any new supply or substitute supply. I hope this is reasonably non-contentious. And also, unfortunately, the history books show us that collapse does happen. And we do have to realize that we are mortal. That's the key missing part about our growth culture. If you are a living species, of course growth is good, and things have been growing for over 3 billion years. But there are limits of all kinds, and death is one of them. I'm sorry to relate this to you. As Randy Udall said, we have to become mortal again. The Greeks, the ancient Greeks, were kind of obsessed with this, and I find that the Greeks are very inspiring and useful people to read in many ways. The underlying message, I think, is that we must face it sooner or later, that demand must come down and local production must go up. The irony is that the more we say the system must be continued more or less as it is, endless growth, massive consumption, increasing population, because it's unpalatable and uncomfortable to say or think otherwise, the less likely we are to begin reorganizing our systems, so that if our ecological systems, including energy supply, are less elastic and resilient than we are assuming, then we shall be all the more unprepared. Planning takes a lot of effort, and we need to encourage ourselves to make all kinds of plans. And that's partly what I was referring to with these many different discussions and conversations. We should have many different kinds of plans. Now, we are indeed talking about a vast systems problem. Population, pollution, species extinction, climate chaos, soil erosion, quality and quantity problems with water, food production, money systems, economic systems, governance, culture, belief systems, both secular and non-secular. We've got ourselves into a giant progress trap, in the words of Ronald Wright. I think we really cooked our goose, to be honest, when we discovered how to control fire, and that was a really long time ago. We are indeed pyrophiles. We love fire, and we depend upon it. And as long as we have large settlements in cold places, we'll go on depending on it, and we have to face up to that, especially those of us who are very interested in the more local solutions and responses. I'll say a word about those words in a minute. We have to reduce that dependence in a measured and planned way. Post-Carbon Institute is trying to address these issues at a systems scale. The progress trap, the energy and ecological declines that we know of, the need to reduce consumption and produce locally. We are working with people around the world at every level, at the personal, the public and policy levels, at the individual, institutional and infrastructural levels, and we are doing this with as many other groups as we can. If governments and UN were to take these systems problems rather more seriously, then perhaps we would be out of a job, which from a planet point of view would be a jolly good thing. But perhaps from my point of view it wouldn't be quite so good. The policy platform we are developing is designed to deliver reduced consumption and local production, and we call it global relocalization. Now, reducing consumption, in our understanding of this, means, let me start again. If we were to reduce consumption so that we could actually produce and meet our daily needs locally, that would surely be a sustainable solution for our species. In fact, I'm not sure that there is another one. And it seems to work for every other species, and I think we should consider giving it a try. It might work for us too. Now, the word local has different meanings in terms of different needs and different places, and to some extent, local needs to be defined locally. But I also think we'll soon start recognizing a local when we see it. And although I'm going to talk about reducing consumption and then producing locally, just in order of what I'm going to say, to some considerable degree, producing locally will reduce consumption. One of the central tasks of Post-Carbon Institute is to help develop new ways of coordinating and cooperating. We have put on events with other groups and sponsor events and help with websites, and I want to make a special mention of Richard Heinberg and Community Solution, and Megan Quinn is here, and I want to mention also Pat Murphy. These are people that we work closely with, especially around these issues of working at the local level. I would also like to recognize that there are many people in this very room with whom we work and who support us in many wonderful ways, and without whom Post-Carbon Institute really wouldn't exist. And I would be still wondering what on earth to do with my mind and this strange fire that burns inside me, a fire that says the strong shall protect the weak, and that we should use our intelligence to protect our planet instead of what we're doing. We want to work with everyone who shares at least some of our basic concerns: the need to reorganize, reduce consumption, produce locally. The one that can't be left out is our concern for non-violence. Now, we need to work together because we are talking about and trying to bring into being structural and infrastructural and institutional change. And I must stress that we are at very early stages at the moment. But I think we have collectively at least come some way in just a few years. Now, some of the initiatives and programs of Post-Carbon Institute I'm going to go through. Global public media, the Relocalization Network. The oil depletion protocol is going to be covered in full by Richard shortly, so I won't say more about that. The Energy Farms Network, community-supported production, and culture. These aren't all the things we're working on, and these aren't all the things that are necessary for relocalization and addressing the kinds of situation we face, but there's some of them, and one has only limited time, in more senses than one. Global Public Media is a public service broadcasting station on the internet. It's public service broadcasting for a post-carbon world. It's our way of offering in-depth information and outreach. And this has been and will continue to be an integral part of our operation, and we hope to expand this greatly in the coming months. The Relocalization Network, it now consists of 128 groups in 11 countries. And we've deliberately set the barrier quite low in financial terms. It's zero, you can't really go much lower than that, for joining, so that we can grow the network. But you do have to agree to relocalize, and not advocate or use violence, while trying to reduce the use of big energy, particularly fossil fuels and nuclear, and not advocating more use of these. Especially in the earlier stages of relocalization, much of the effort is on reducing consumption. Some people stress that we have a moral problem, but more than anything, we have a molecules problem. We are moving too many of them, too far, too fast, and too often. That's Newtonian physics. We don't need to invoke Einstein. What particular kinds of consumption or molecule moving need to be reduced? And I especially use the passive here. In journalism school, one was taught to avoid the passive, but I don't want to personalize it. So I'm going to be, as it were, passive, use the passive voice where I can. We can start with the consumption of meat and fish and of mobility. That means all kinds of travel in terms of mobility. Meat and fish consumption, I'm sure as many of you know, is very energy intensive, and so that's one reason why we need to turn some rather serious attention to that. But in terms of travel, I have to note that how did I get here? I'm in Boston. I didn't walk here. Of course, I flew from the west coast of Canada. And moving goods and humans is clearly one of the key things that we'll have to reduce if there is less energy around to move things. It's also Newtonian physics. Part of this work is taking us more and more into the realms of local government and planners. And this is a good thing, I believe, and it's part of what encourages me. We and our colleagues and partners are talking more and more to councillors, to mayors, to planners and planning associates, to architects and developers, the very people who build much of our problematic infrastructure. But to an extent, they are building according to what will sell. In other words, what the consumer wants, which is ultimately, us. We're all part of that. Why is changing infrastructure, especially the built infrastructure, so important? If we are to reduce our consumption of mobility, then we and our vital and not so vital, no doubt, stuff will need to travel less and at less speed. We need to put our systems closer together so that we travel less distance to our food, to our work, our shops, our schools, our friends, less distance to everything. And we need to travel more publicly and less privately. We need to do more things together. And that means a very different infrastructure from what we have now in North America. To put it very mildly, this is going to be challenging. But there are models that we can at least look at, and many of them are in Europe, and many are also in the history books. Whether or not you think it is lunacy to consider going back, we surely have to agree that before the mid-19th century, all our infrastructure was pre-petroleum. even if it wasn't all pre-coal, especially in the case of Britain. But we shall have to move stuff around, and we shall need to do so for some considerable time to come. This is partly the result of living in cold places and having 6.5 billion of us. This means we shall need external energy, and in order to start living within our solar ration in a sensible way, we need to treat our land and soil very differently. We are covering our land capable of supporting photosynthesis with buildings and roads, and this is one of the most alarming things that we are doing. If this is to change, it means structural and infrastructural changes, changes in land use and changes in land ownership. Not a small topic, and not one without contention, I would venture. Furthermore, it is extremely hard to see how we can go on expanding our cities. Some of us, including Richard Heinberg and Pat Murphy, are going to be writing about re-ruralization, the need for people to leave cities and start working back in primary production. We need to speak of answers. At Post-Carbon Institute, we tend not to speak so much of answers and solutions, although I have used those words, but rather, and more generally, of responses. And that's because I personally, anyway, don't wish to engender the idea that this is 2 plus 4, 2 plus 2 equals 4. You know, that's a kind of solution. So that's why we tend to speak of responses. These are things that we're trying out. There's no pretense that all of these things are going to work. Now, having said that, I mentioned miracles in one of those little quotes earlier on. And although I don't believe in miracles, there is something which could work and could deliver absolutely massive reductions in energy and materials use, and it could do so almost instantly. I wonder if anybody can imagine what it is. It's called sharing. And it's as simple as that. But it runs counter to most of what we've been taught in the industrialized world. And I want to mention a very powerful example that could unlock a great deal of potential change, and that is car sharing. I don't have many more minutes, so I won't go into many details, but car sharing, and there's a very good example in Vancouver, and there are a couple of dozen in the rest of North America, and many more in Europe. Car sharing, if we could implement it quite quickly, and it could be done quickly with municipal help, could have a dramatic effect on car use, vehicle miles traveled, and the amount of emissions, the amount of energy used very, very quickly. It would start to affect absolutely everything else with amazing speed. It's one of the reasons why I'm pretty passionate about car sharing, although I'm on record as not liking cars very much. So there are many things that I have to swallow. It's an irony for me, but car sharing is something I think we should all consider very carefully. There are many other things that we need to share, but I don't have time to go into more details on that. In the following few remarks that I've got only a couple of minutes left. It's important to bear in mind that the first thing we have to keep in front of our minds is reducing consumption. But now I'm going to just spend a couple of minutes talking about the production side. And one of the initiatives and programs that we are working on and spreading is the Local Energy Farms Network. This is a large, and this is intended to be a large and linked network of small local farms designed to produce food, I stress food, fuel, feedstock and fertilizer with less land than we currently use, with less land than we're currently using in our fields at the moment, and with no petroleum products. It's with this idea of trying to use less land that I hope that we will avoid some of the very well-founded fears that we will push food production out and use fuel in order to produce fuel. One of the hopes in doing this is that we rebuild the soil and our forests, as well as feeding and provisioning ourselves and keeping ourselves in some reasonably decent way without continuing to ransack the planet. A modest ambition, I think we can all agree. How do I stop this? There we are. I'm not sure whether the pinger here agrees with me. I do want to stress that I am very concerned about food production, as I've said. But if you use fuel, I see no alternative in the long term. We have a couple of examples so far in Vancouver, Canada, and Willits, California. I won't say more about that. I will have to whiz through the last bit. We are growing a large range of energy crops, and we're trying to do it with as little irrigation and as little petroleum use as possible. One of our aims is to produce reliable, renewable energy at a commercial and community scale. We want to help end the situation whereby every megawatt of wind, for instance, needs to be backed up by a megawatt of coal or nuclear. And we're also developing our own vertical axis wind turbines, so far made out of wood and fabric. And we're using old ideas and new ideas, and we're using them in interesting combinations. And the final word I want to say something about is community-supported production. It's my belief that we have to return to local production. That's one of the single most important things we should be doing. We should be reducing our daily needs as locally and regionally as we possibly can. Some of these things are difficult and some of them are dirty, and we need to do them under our noses and try and clean them up. We will need skills that we've forgotten. We'll need to be careful, and we'll need to rebuild the infrastructure and supply chains to do that. Also in this, I believe, although it's a strange subject to some, we must consider the difficulties with the money supply system. And I've done some work on energy-backed currency. There may be a chance with the questions to talk a bit more about that, but I believe that if you have a renewable energy-backed currency, it will help tune the economy to the kind of energy and resources that are available and discourage us from the kind of massive predation, I'm afraid, in which we've been engaging in for rather a long time. And finally, culture. We have beliefs which I think are unfortunate, in abundance, in individualism, in economics, in the invisible hand, and these are going to be challenged. But I want to end on a note of delight, and that, if you will pardon the previous pun, is music. One of the things that I think allowed Cuba to face up to its enforced, as it were, peak oil crisis was music. They were used to playing and dancing and singing with each other, mainly using non-amplified instruments, so if there was no electricity, they could still do it. I think that without playing music together, I am not sure we can accomplish what we need to accomplish, this sharing, this working together. And whatever happens as we go over the peak of oil, gas, and maybe some other things too, we can at least try to share more, work together more, and play together more. Thank you very much.